species will be doing the invading? And so these questions help us better understand invasion susceptibility and can help us allocate limited resources more efficiently. We know that time and money and resources are in short supply, and so trying to figure out which areas might get these invasive species and just how many species are going to invade are big questions that could help us manage these species more efficiently. So I'm going to start the first half of the presentation talking about how many plants become invasive, and then I'll get to that second question of where they become invasive in the second half of my presentation. So one of the big hypotheses in invasion ecology about how many species will invade is called the tens rule. And so if you're not familiar with the tens rule, this is a quick overview. So if we have any number of species that are introduced to a new environment, in this example, we'll say we have 100 species that are introduced to a new environment, the tens rule would say that 10% of those species are going to establish. And when I say establish, I mean they will have self-sustaining populations. So 10% of those will establish, and then the tens rule also says that 10% of those established species will become invasive. So now we're down to just 1% of the original group that has invasive impacts according to this hypothesis. So for the purpose of our testing, we focused on the second half of this. So 10% of established species become invasive. And the reason we focused on the second half is because it's really hard to find data for the first half. Finding data on failed introductions is really difficult, but we do have lots of good data on established and invasive species. So that's what we're going to focus on. And for the rest of the presentation, I'll call this percentage of established species that invade, I'll call those invasion rates, just so that we're all using the same terminology here. So just to recap where we're at so far, predictions of invasion rates, established species that become invasive, are important. The tens rule is one common prediction of these invasion rates, but evidence for this tens rule is lacking. We have lots of studies that have tried to test it, but they vary in kind of the taxa that they use and the scale that they measure it at. So we used global data to test whether or not the tens rule is valid. And we did this at 4 main regions. So there are 4 different levels you can think of them as. Level 1 is continents, so North America. Level 2 is regions, so that would be like Eastern Canada. Level 3 is provinces, so Ontario is a good example. And then level 4 are these things called basic recording units. And so that would be like St. Pierre. And I also want to make it clear at this point that I realize St. Pierre is not in Ontario, that like this isn't zooming down quite right. The reason I have St. Pierre in here is because it's the only level 4 region in all of Canada. So it's important to note that most of the world is not broken down into level 4. Most of the world only goes down to level 3, but we do have some places with this kind of like extra resolution of data. So if you're wondering where we got all of these things from, these levels come from the World Geographical Scheme for Recording Plant Distributions. This will not be on the test later, but this is something that I wanted to bring up just so that you know, this is not something we created. This is a predetermined scheme for this, and it's specifically made for recording plant distributions, which is why we used it. So then I'll go ahead and kind of give away some of our results right off the bat here. So on this graph, you can see across the bottom, we have L1, L2, L3, and L4, which are our 4 scales. And then on the y-axis, we have invasion rate. And so you can see a couple of patterns right off the bat. First, most of these percentages are higher than 10%. So 10% is our dotted line here. Most of these proportions are much higher than 10%. So right off the bat, it looks like the tens rule is not really a good estimate of these invasion rates. The other thing that we see, which comes out pretty clearly here, is that invasion rates get smaller as you get narrower in scale. And so I'll talk more about both of these patterns in a little bit more detail with each one of these different levels. So these are our results just from level 1. And so I've got it kind of highlighted here. We'll kind of work our way through this graph. You can't see a whole lot of spatial patterns when we're this far zoomed out, but the big takeaway from this level is that the average is 25%, which is much, much higher than 10%. These 3 little asterisks mean that that percentage is statistically significant when compared to 10%. So 25%, a lot bigger than 10%, and this is using 12,000 species at this scale. So some good evidence that the tens rule is maybe not as good of an estimate as we would have hoped. If we zoom in a little bit to level 2, we get a little bit more detail here. Some of these level 2 regions are countries. So Mexico, Brazil, China, Australia, those are their own level 2 regions. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because those regions have invasive plant regulations kind of at the country scale. So this is where we first start to see some relevance in terms of invasive plant management. And once again, you can see 21% is much higher than 10%. It's slightly lower than the level 1 proportions, but it's still much higher. If we zoom in even a little bit more, now we get a lot better resolution. So now we're down to the provinces in Canada, we're down to the states in the United States, and for the rest of the world, we're pretty close to the country scale. So this level is super relevant in terms of invasive plant management. This is like what a lot of different places are using, or a lot of different areas that have regulations are looking at invasion rates at this scale. And so you can see, once again, this proportion, 17%, is higher than 10%. So this pattern kind of holds even as these invasion rates kind of get smaller and smaller as we go through these different scales. The scales that are most relevant to invasive plant managers are much higher than 10%. And lastly, we can look at these level 4 regions, but as you can see, the world is kind of blank on this map. And as I mentioned before, the reason for this is not necessarily that we don't have data for it. The reason for this is that the scheme we used for these levels just doesn't go down to level 4 in most of the places in the world. So we're down to about half of the species that we started with. And this average does kind of intersect 10% on our graph here. But again, this scale is not used in a lot of places. It's not particularly relevant for management. So we can just kind of move past that. So our two big takeaways from this first question. So if we're asking how many species invade, our answer would be that the 10s rule should really be the 20s rule. If you look at the two scales that are most relevant for management, that's level 2 and level 3. If you kind of split the difference between these two dots, we end up kind of right at 20%. So for plants specifically, we're really only looking at plants here. The 10s rule should be the 20s rule. And as we mentioned, this proportion changes depending on the scale that you look at it. That's an interesting piece of variation and something that we've kind of attributed to essentially just incorporating more different habitats as you zoom out. If you think of a species that invades, temperate forests really well, the odds that that temperate forest that can be invaded is included in your study region increases as you zoom your study region out and incorporate more and more different habitats. So there are some interesting pieces of variation in this data. And so we wanted to delve into that a little bit more, which is how we ended up at the second question, which is, where do plants frequently become invasive? So now moving kind of away from the 10s rule, which was our hypothesis for the first half, now we have two other hypotheses for this second half. And so one common hypothesis in invasion ecology is called the island susceptibility hypothesis, which is exactly what it sounds like. It says islands should be invaded more often than mainlands. The reasoning for this is that islands have fewer herbivores and kind of this ecological naivete or evolutionary naivete, basically meaning that these species on islands tend to have younger evolutionary histories. They're not as well evolved to each other. And with fewer herbivores on the islands, we think invasive plants should be doing better there than on mainlands, which do have kind of all of these other components. The other hypothesis that we'll look at here is called the biotic resistance hypothesis. The idea behind this is that species-rich environments should be invaded less often than species-poor environments. This is basically comes from the idea that the more species you have, the more niches are occupied. The fewer species you have, the more ecological space there is for an invader to move in and start invading. And so we'll kind of extend this biotic resistance hypothesis to climates. Since tropics are known as kind of biodiversity hotspots, we think that tropics should be more resistant to invasion and temperate regions should be less resistant to invasion. So I'll come back to this climate piece in just a minute, but we'll first start out. I'll give a quick recap. Predictions of invasion susceptibility are important. We think that islands and temperate regions should be more susceptible to invasions, and we use the same set of global data to test these assumptions. So we'll start with the island results, and what we found is that we found support for the island susceptibility hypothesis. So we tested this at two different scales, one at the global scale and then at the L3 scale that I talked about. And what we see is that islands are invaded more often than mainlands. It's that simple. So at both of these scales, the islands are the blue and then mainlands are the green. And at both of these scales, these results are statistically significant. So we do see islands are invaded more often than mainlands. And we do think it's because of the reasons that are set forth in the island susceptibility hypothesis. So now we'll return to that biotic resistance hypothesis, and we'll look at that through the lens of different climates. So we divided all of these regions into their respective climates. And so you can see here, the one that you might not be familiar with is the continental climate. I think the rest of them are pretty common. Continental is this kind of northern regions, kind of in between temperate and polar. So we calculated invasion rates for each one of those climates, and we found that tropical climates are particularly susceptible to invasion. So tropical climates are this dark blue dot up here, and then you can see the other climates are significantly less invaded than tropical regions. We also subdivided these results by islands and mainlands. And so if we just look at islands and we take all of the tropical islands and compare them to the arid and temperate and continental islands, we find the same pattern, that tropical islands are really heavily invaded and that islands with other climates are not nearly as invaded. And then we subsetted this again by mainlands, and we find again that tropical mainlands are invaded more often than any of the other climates. Although these results are not quite as large, the difference between tropical and arid is not statistically significant, but we still do see higher invasion rates in tropical regions than elsewhere. So this is particularly interesting to us because our hypothesis was that islands would be more resistant to invasion, and our results show us the opposite. So we flip our little caret here and we find that tropical regions are actually being invaded more often than anywhere else. So what's going on with this? We dug into these results a little bit more, and what we found is essentially that species can move into the tropics from any of the other climates because they're coming from harsher climates and moving into the tropics, which are relatively consistent and less variable. So we have species moving from polar regions to the tropics, moving from continental to the tropics, moving from arid and from temperate regions into the tropics. And so the reason they're able to do that is because their native climates are particularly harsh, and in comparison, the tropics are more favorable. If you think about the extremely long days or long nights in polar regions, depending on the season, you kind of lose that and you get much more consistent solar radiation in the tropics. If you think about big swings in temperature and precipitation in these other climates, the tropics don't have that. They have very consistent temperature and precipitation trends. And so the tropics tend to be generally favorable regardless of where you're coming from, and that includes the tropics. Species that are native to the tropics can move to other tropical regions as well. So we think this is what's driving this interesting pattern in the fact that the tropic regions are most susceptible to invasion.
You have 1 more minute.
Thanks. So these are our 2 big takeaways from this second question, is that islands and tropical climates are particularly susceptible to invasion. So you might be thinking, well, we don't have, a whole lot of islands or tropical regions in Canada. So what does this all mean for us? And so here are my implications for management moving forward. So first, provinces should assume 20% of established plants will invade. So this is higher than our previous assumption of 10%. We should update our assumptions and now double them and make them 20%. We should also assume that if you are managing a widely varied environment, an environment with lots of heterogeneity in it, it will be invaded more often than a similarly sized environment that has less variation. More variation in your environment means more possible different invaders could invade there. We should also think about plants from polar and continental climates as our biggest threats. Those are going to be the species that are moving from harsher areas into our continental and temperate climates. And so those are going to be the species that are going to have the easiest time making that transition. We shouldn't expect a whole lot of species moving from arid and tropical regions up into our continental climates. And lastly, in North America, mainlands are just as susceptible as islands. Most of our island susceptibility evidence comes from the tropics, but if you get up into these continental climates, mainlands and islands are kind of equally susceptible, and sometimes mainlands are more susceptible. So the island susceptibility hypothesis is not as relevant for continental climates like Canada. So that's all I've got. I want to take a moment to thank my funding sources, the Lotta Crabtree Trust and the NECASC, as well as the Spatial Ecology Lab and this wonderful group of undergraduate students that's helped out with this project. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Will. We do have a couple questions in the Q&A already. Jennifer asks, can you provide a couple of examples of species native to temperate regions that are invasive in tropical regions?
Oh man, that's a great question. So and something I should have thought about, but one of the downsides of doing research at such a broad scale and looking at 12,000 species is that I don't have a species name right off the top of my head. If you send me an email, I can certainly dig around in our database and pull out a couple of species. Yeah, at this scale, 12,000 of them kind of all jumbled together in my mind.
Absolutely. And Will's email is obviously right up on the screen there, but it's also in the chat if you think of a question afterwards. Elliot asks, are tropical to tropical invasions more common or polar and continental to tropical invasions more common?
They all occur at about the same rate. So this is one of the really interesting things. We broke down not just the recipient climates of the places that are being invaded most often, we also broke that down by native climates. So we have native regions for all of the species in our data set, and we said basically which of those pairs of like native to invaded ranges for climates are most common. And we find that native climates don't really make a difference, that everything kind of invades the tropics at the same rate, regardless of the climate that they've originated from. So I think that answers that question. Yeah.
Absolutely. Lauren asks, if tropics are more easily invaded because they have a consistent climate, why is the management implication that a more varied climate is more susceptible, unless I misunderstood?
Yeah, sorry, I probably didn't explain that as well as I could. So when I say a more varied climate, I mean, or a more varied environment is more susceptible. I mean that in terms of environmental characteristics, not necessarily climate characteristics. So if you have wetlands and forest and kind of, I don't know, a bunch of different habitats that are all within the same climate, that represents kind of a lot of environmental variability, even though the climate is the same across all of those. So we see tropical climates are most invaded, but within each one of the climates, it's these like small scale habitat heterogeneity that's going to increase your invasion rates. Yeah, so environmental variability increases invasion rates, whereas climate consistency increases invasion rates, if that makes sense.
Thank you for that clarity. And then someone asked for clarification when you say varied / heterogeneous environments are more susceptible to invasions. On your final slide, are you referring to heterogeneity in species composition and ecosystem composition?
Yeah, so both. And so the other, I guess, clarifying thing that I can mention for this is that when we say that they're more likely to be invaded, it's not that like each one of those single components is more likely to be invaded. It's the fact that you're just including more different environments when you look at it at a large scale, like we're looking at it. So when you zoom out, we kind of see this pattern because we've now collected all of these smaller things together. And so, yeah, all of those different factors that would make an environment different and that would allow like a different like character of invader to come in is going to increase your invasion rate when you zoom out and look at it at a broader scale.
Excellent. And that's all we have time for questions, but there are a couple more in the Q&A. If you wouldn't mind, Will, just going in there and typing your answers. And again, Will's email is in the chat. If you think of more questions, you can pass along an email. Thank you so much, Will.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, next I'd like to introduce Vicki Zhang from the University of Toronto, Mississauga to talk about limits to plant invasions at the edge of the Arctic. Welcome, Vicki.
Great. Thanks, Darissa. Hopefully you can see my screen and you can hear me and you can see the laser pointer.
Yep, it's
awesome.
all working.
Thank you. I've been having internet connectivity issues all morning, so I apologize in advance for that if anything pops up. My name is Vicki. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, and I'm really excited today to be talking about some of the new work that's come out of the lab, and I'm here to talk about some of my work as well as Francine's work. She's a master's student in the lab. I don't need to introduce non-native species to this crowd, but essentially they are species that have been introduced over a biogeographical barrier to a new habitat outside of their native range. I just have two examples on the screen here. This is common plantain on the bottom and toadflax on the left, and these are both species that I will be talking about today. So non-native species can become invasive if they are dominant and widespread, and they can really threaten native biodiversity. But not all non-native species that invade a new area can become invasive. And this is because there are several barriers that limit the success of non-native species. So once they move past this geographical barrier, they're in a new environment, and these new conditions in this environment, such as temperature and precipitation, that might not be optimal. Then non-native species can encounter reproductive barriers, so maybe they can't produce viable seed or offspring. And so most non-native species at this stage will be unable to reproduce, and then they go extinct in a couple of generations. There's also barriers to dispersal, so that they might not be able to spread from their site of introduction. And it's only if non-native species have moved past all of these barriers and become dominant that they're considered invasive. Subarctic invasions are understudied. This is one of the few areas worldwide where ecosystems are currently minimally affected by non-native species, and it's maybe because of one of these barriers on the screen. There have been recent studies that have documented rapid non-native species invasions in some hotspots in northern ecosystems. And again, it's unclear which barrier to invasion is involved. And so today's talk will focus on disentangling the effect of two of these barriers, environmental and dispersal barriers. But I am happy to talk about some reproductive barriers. There's some interesting things happening if there are questions later on. My research takes place in Churchill, Manitoba. It's indicated by the red dot here on the map. It lies on the coast of the Hudson Bay, and it's in Treaty 5 territory. So it's traditionally the meeting place of the Inuit, the Dene, the Cree, and the Métis nations. It also, interestingly, lies on the transition zone between the boreal forest and the tundra ecosystem, and it's very well known for its wildlife, including polar bears and northern lights. Historically, Churchill was a grain and shipping port. So over 100 non-native species have been reported here since 1929, when the railway was completed. And so because of this railway terminal and the required grain cleaning steps, the grain elevators that are pictured here, they've been heavily bombarded by non-native seeds and plant material. And since then, non-native species have been recorded all around town, in buildings, in landfills, basically in any human disturbed area, but they have failed so far to spread into the more natural tundra and boreal forest. And so at this latitude, Churchill is an outlier because you have hundreds of non-native species documented, but they're failing to spread. So for today's talk, I'm going to be presenting some preliminary results from 3 different experiments. And the first 2 experiments are transplant experiments where we translocated 3 focal perennial species into the tundra and boreal forest. These are 3 species that are locally common in Churchill, but again, they're failing to escape these human disturbed areas. And the third experiment is a survey that was done by Francine with the help of an undergrad student, Brianna, and this was conducted this summer as part of Francine's master's thesis. So starting with testing dispersal barriers, seeds of non-native species may be unable to disperse into new areas without physical introduction. And once they're present, they might fail at the seedling stage. And so this results in localized invasions where non-native species can only persist where they have been introduced. In particular, roadsides can serve as a corridor to invasion, especially via vehicles and human footwear. And unpaved roads, especially like the ones pictured here, require roadside maintenance, and recreational vehicles traverse these roads commonly, and that can lead to long-distance dispersal. Dispersal limitations might be able to explain why there are fewer non-native species at higher latitudes. Because of that limited accessibility, this results in a lower number of introduction events. So what we did was completely remove dispersal and establishment barriers by just randomly transplanting these 3 non-native species into blocks in the tundra and in the boreal forest. And we did this in 2021, and then we returned last year in 2022 to sample for successful emergence. And we also recorded performance metrics, so how big the plants were at the end of the growing season. And we predicted that plants are going to be limited by dispersal. So that means once we do transplant them manually, they will be able to survive through the winter and reemerge the next year. We also predicted that there would be differences between the boreal forest and the tundra. So I'm going to walk you through the results. This might be a little messy at the end, so I'll just start with explaining one species here. So along the y-axis, I have the cumulative proportion of germinated, this should say germinated plants. And along the x-axis, I have time. This is time starting from June 6th all the way to the end of the growing season in mid-August. And essentially what these graphs will look like are curves. These are survival curves starting from the beginning of the growing season when we started sampling to the end of the growing season. So I'm just going to put up one species here. This is Linaria. So this is the yellow toadflax, survival curves from the beginning to the end of the growing season. And so for Linaria, we had about 92% success, emergent success in the boreal forest. And this is the left side panel here. And then about a 78% emergence success in the tundra. So this is just for one species. I'm going to put up the other 2 species, and you can pretty clearly see a trend here where we have a greater proportion of survival in the boreal forest and a faster rate of emergence in the boreal forest, but over 50% of emergence at the end of the growing season across all 3 species in both transplant locations. And so this is pretty stark visual evidence that there is dispersal limitations of these non-native species such that once they are transplanted into the boreal forest and tundra, they are still able to survive. Next, I'll show you some performance metrics. So again, I'm going to start with one species at a time. This is along the x-axis, I have the transplant location, boreal and tundra, and along the y-axis, I have the average height. And this is average height of Linaria, so average height of the yellow toadflax. And I'm putting up the average height right now, so you can see that there is a significant difference in height, such that Linaria transplanted into the boreal forest were much bigger and grew taller compared to the tundra. Similarly, for dandelion, because it grows in a rosette, we measured the length of the longest leaf, and that's plotted along the y-axis. Again, along the x-axis, we have the transplant location. And we're seeing that there is a significant difference in leaf length where dandelion grown in the boreal forest were bigger, but we didn't see any differences in performance for common plantain. So to summarize this first experiment, after the first year of observations, we found that plants were able to survive given translocation in new sites, so they are dispersal limited. And there are differences between the boreal forest and the tundra. This actually matches biogeographical patterns that we see across Canada, where the boreal forest is slightly more invaded or easier to invade compared to the tundra. In this case, it's probably because the boreal forest is slightly more sheltered, further away from the coast, potentially warmer. Moving on to the second experiment, this is a transplant experiment testing the effect of different soil origins. So in Churchill, there have been several sites that have received additional soil input due to soil dumping in the past, either for construction or roadside repairs. And these are sites that are currently dominated by non-native populations. It's possible that these sites might be favorable for non-native species to establish. Maybe they benefit from some kind of nutrient enrichment, or they could be germinating from a persisting seed bank. And it's exciting for me because we just submitted a proof of concept paper yesterday documenting evidence that there is a persistent non-native species seed bank that are spreading along with soil movement. So I'm happy to talk more about that as well. But for this experiment, we set up a common garden experiment in the tundra with 2 different soil sources. So one source of soil was collected from sites in Churchill with a history of soil dumping, which I call dump soil. And the other is just the original tundra soil that we disturbed, but we kept within the plot. And so from these 2 images, you can clearly see that there is a visual difference between the 2 soil types. And again, we transplanted these 3 non-native species into these blocks, and we predicted that plants grown in the dump soil will perform better, even though they're still out in the tundra in this unsheltered landscape. So again, I'm showing you survivorship curves. This time they're non-parametric, so they won't be nice smooth curves. But again, I have the proportion of species emergence along the y-axis and then the time along the x-axis from June to mid-August, again colored by species, and separated whether they were in dump soil or tundra soil. So for all 3 species, I'm putting all 3 species data up here. For all 3 species, there's no significant difference in survival between soil origin types at the end of the growing season. And this was just analyzed using end of season survivor data. This may be because all 3 species were transplanted out into the tundra. And so you see slightly lower proportions of species emergence compared to the boreal forest. We didn't have a common garden out in the boreal forest, but in any case, there was no difference. But there was a difference in dandelion performance. So here I have along the y-axis the average length of the longest leaf for dandelion, and along the x-axis I have the soil origin type. And there was a significant difference in that dandelion plants that were grown in dump soil performed better. They were much bigger than the ones in the tundra. But there was no difference in performance for Linaria or plantain. So after this first year of sampling, we conclude that maybe Linaria and plantain, because they don't have higher survival or better performance in dump soil, they might not benefit from this soil dumping, this history of soil dumping, but dandelion might be able to benefit from this dump soil. So we're going to focus in on just dandelions at this point, and we're looking at buildings this time as a shelter for dandelions. So in the past, we've noticed that dandelions tend to grow better on south-facing sides of buildings, and these are huge populations with large individuals. And so we predict that buildings can act as a shelter and a windbreaker, creating suitable microhabitats for dandelions. So my lab mate Francine, along with the help of Brianna in undergrad, surveyed native Arctic dandelion and invasive common dandelion around 23 buildings in Churchill. So they counted the number of dandelions within a 50 centimeter square transect, and they measured performance such as leaf length and flowering. And they asked whether common dandelions had higher survival on south-facing sides of buildings compared to north-facing sides and compared to native dandelions. Again, this might be a very messy plot, so I'll walk you through the axes first. So along the y-axis here, we have the average number of individuals for each building. And then we have distance along the x-axis. We have 4 panels, so we have northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest for the 4 different sides of buildings. And this is just because of the orientation of Churchill. It's not exactly a north, south, east, west orientation. It's slightly turned around. The rows are slightly tilted. And along the secondary y-axis, I have, this is Arctic native dandelion, Taraxacum lacrum, and Taraxacum officinale. This is the invasive dandelion.
Yeah, 15 minutes, Vicki.
Thanks. So I'm just putting up one panel here so far. This is just the northeast side for common dandelion. And I'm going to populate the whole graph now. So this is just the data for common dandelion, where we're seeing the highest number of dandelions along southeast and southwest sides, and there is a preference for closer proximity to buildings, where you have more dandelions closer to buildings. whereas we don't see that pattern for native dandelion. There is higher numbers on southwest sides, but there's no real preference for closer distance to buildings. So we conclude that there are more invasive dandelions on south sides of buildings, and this is still work that's in progress. So to conclude, I hope I've convinced you that this work is novel, and we're excited to continue this into future years. And we really think it's key to understanding the emerging issue of invasions in the Canadian North. So to summarize, high latitude environments are currently dominated by native vegetation. We think that there's low dispersal abilities that's limiting spread, but it seems like some species, such as dandelion, might be able to benefit if some barriers to invasions are removed. This is important because with climate change and increased human activity, this can make northern ecosystems much more vulnerable to invasions. Anthropogenic stressors can increase invasion success, especially if there are vectors for seed dispersal or if there are buildings that can facilitate non-native species establishment. So Churchill could really be a hotspot for future invasions. I want to thank my funding sources, my supervisor, Peter, my lab mates, and everyone at the Northern Study Center for helping me with a lot of the field work. And I want to thank you for your attention today. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Vicki. I think that was a very fitting presentation right after Will. His was very like zoomed out scope, and then we got, a bit more right on the landscape. And I think that, the tundra and boreal division where Churchill is, it kind of relates very similarly to where he delineated the polar and continental regions. So I think that was very interesting. We do have a question from Lauren. What measures did your team take to make sure the translocated plants were removed or prevented from spreading where they were introduced?
That's a really good question, and I never have time to talk about it during any talks. So we are very careful in making sure we can find all of these transplanted plants at the end of the growing season. We use flagging tape, stakes, nails to mark each individual plant. And so we're fairly confident, or 100% confident, that we can find all of our plants at the end of the growing season and into the next year. These plants haven't been removed yet. We're planning on sampling in future years. And we're obviously worried about starting the spread of non-native species if we're transplanting into natural habitats. But because these habitats are so far uninvaded, we're confident that the plants that we translocate and the plants that we transplant won't be, the start of potential new spread. Seeing that we can find them again every year, and that we just think that the habitat won't be enough for them to survive every year. So we are planning on removing them after all sampling is done, but they're still out there currently, and we're planning on sampling in future years.
Excellent, thank you. We have one more question from Lauren. Do you remove seed heads and seeds for multi-year sampling?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we were planning on looking at fitness metrics, so seed heads, seed counts, flower heads. This year it was just so low. We had 1 or 2 dandelions that produce seeds, and we also had some other, like Linaria, so toadflax, produce seed buds, but they weren't enough to be able to collect the seeds. We just think the growing season is too short for them, and seed production is just so low for some of these species. But in future years, if there are higher numbers of flower head production and seed production, that is data that we're looking to collect. But this year there was just 2, so we couldn't really do any statistical analysis on that.
Excellent. That's some interesting data in of itself.
Yeah.
All right. In the interest of time, we're going to move on, but I did see another question pop up there, Vicki, if you wouldn't mind hopping in there and answering that.
Absolutely.
Vicki's email is in the chat box if you're looking to send her any emerging questions afterwards. Thank you so much, Vicki.
Great. Thanks, Teresa.
All right. To close off this session, I'd like to introduce Cathy Kavassalis from the Canadian Coalition for Invasive Plant Regulation to talk about the slowing of the flow of invasive species on the horticultural highway. Thank you so much for joining us, Cathy.
Thank you, Teresa. Are my slides visible to you?
Yes, they look great.
Great. Okay. Well, good morning. I am Cathy Kavassalis from the Canadian Coalition for Invasive Plant Regulation and Master Gardeners of Ontario. And I'm really pleased to be with you today to talk about the need to reduce the sales of ornamental invasive plants in Canada. Invasive species are one of the primary drivers of biodiversity loss. They compete for resources, disrupt food webs, transmit pests and diseases, and alter the environment. To protect biological diversity upon which our lives depend, Canada must reduce the rate of introduction and establishment of non-native invasive species by at least 50% by 2030. We know biodiversity is in peril, and invasive plants are part of the problem. But most do not know that the ornamental horticultural industry is the primary pathway for invasive species to enter Canada. The primacy of this pathway has been confirmed by many studies around the globe. While Canada recognizes the problem of ornamental invasive plants, Canada's policies, regulatory tools, and resource allocations are inadequate to control this pathway. We must improve our abilities to assess risk, to share that information, and to stop the sale of high-risk plants, and to inform consumers about the risks that these invasive ornamental plants pose. Plant introductions increase invasion success. This is called the propagule pressure hypothesis. When a plant with the right biological traits that allow it to displace other species finds the right environment, it will begin to spread. And as the numbers of individuals released into a region increases, the greater the ecological impact. Each time a vendor sells an invasive plant, the chances for invasion success increases. Therefore, reducing the sales of invasive ornamental plants is very important. On the left is a multi-phase graph indicating the stages of invasion. In a recent robust study, Ming Nai has confirmed that it can take long periods of time before invasiveness is recognized. For instance, the well-known invasive plant purple loosestrife was first documented in North America in the early 1800s. But its potential invasiveness was not noted until 100 years later. We know that the sales of plants in large numbers over the years, a sale of this plant over the years was responsible for its invasion success. What happens when a plant like yellow flag iris, which is popular in the nursery trade, gets identified as invasive? Like purple loosestrife, it is an invader of wetlands. The map on the upper right is a US risk assessment. 100% of the simulated risk assessment scores indicate this plant is a high-risk invader for most of the United States. In 2009, Fisheries and Oceans Canada flagged this as a high-risk species for Canada, and yet FOC took no action because it was unclear to them who was responsible. The Commissioner on the Environment in 2019 recognized this failure to act as a serious problem. Yellow flag iris, along with many aquatic plants sold in even higher volume, have flowed through a very large regulatory gap. In 2001, an import ban on invasive aquatics like parrot's feather, water chestnut, and fanmort was canceled. When researchers asked why, they were told that the plants did not fall under the definition of pest, and I'll talk about that definition shortly. The agency responsible also stated that they lacked the scientific capacity to evaluate potential environmental impacts. There was a lack of interdepartmental policy to engage with other departments who could perhaps have helped. This Venn diagram describes the current regulatory process. The federal government is responsible for preventing introductions and movement of invasive plants that are not widely distributed. Once established in Canada, responsibility falls to other levels of government and non-governmental stakeholders. So the problem caused by invasive ornamental plants that have escaped cultivation has largely fallen to the provinces and territories, and their response has been highly variable. Some have no regulations for invasive plants. Several report gaps in invasive plant regulations. Several report lack of knowledge and information, including name confusion, a lack of standard definitions, a lack of information on distribution and impacts. Several struggle with lack of legal jurisdiction, and most report a lack of resources. Federal regulation, federal leadership here is required for the public good, for clarity, fairness, and for equity. To understand why the federal government doesn't take more regulatory action, we need to step back and understand our international obligations with regard to invasive plants. Within the federal government, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has the primary responsibility for the prevention of the importation and the domestic movement of invasive plants. The CFIA is Canada's representative to the International Plant Protection Convention. This is a multilateral treaty that aims to prevent the introduction and spread of pests of plants, including invasive plants. Before taking any regulatory action, the CFIA applies standards developed under the IPPC. This is done to meet obligations under another international agreement called the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures, or SBS agreement, which was created to prevent unfair restrictions on trade. Adherence to these standards has created some issues that I will describe shortly, but it's important to note that the CFIA does not apply guidelines developed under the Convention on Biological Diversity. So the federal government has the obligation to manage the movement of invasive plants. And the CFIA is charged with this task. And they have two federal laws with which to do this. The first is the Seeds Act, which protects the quality of seeds sold in Canada from weed seed contaminants. Purple loosestrife, for instance, is regulated under the Seeds Act as a noxious weed. This does not really prevent the spread of purple loosestrife, and it does not prohibit the sale of the plant. To prevent the sale of plants, they must be regulated under the Plant Protection Act. That act was written to ensure food security and to protect plant resources. It has largely been used to protect plants from agricultural and forestry sectors. For instance, on the lower left is Japanese barberry. It is prohibited for sale across Canada because it can carry a disease that impacts grain production, not because it's a threat to biodiversity, which it is. Protecting biodiversity is outside the scope of either law. To become a federally prohibited plant, a plant must be classified as a quarantine pest. Sorry to be a bit technical here, but it is important. Under international standards, the definition of a quarantine pest is an invasive plant that can cause impacts of potential economic importance. They must either not be present in Canada or be limited in distribution. And there must be efforts in place to keep them under control. And there's a lot to unpack here. So let me give an example with kudzu, which is an invasive ornamental vine. It is present in Canada, but only occurs to a limited extent in southwestern Ontario. And there are efforts in place to control the population. It has been shown to harm the production of shrubs and trees like Christmas trees. So therefore it has potential impacts of economic importance. So kudzu meets the definition of quarantine pest, and its sale and distribution is prohibited in Canada. However, very few ornamental plants are ever classified as quarantine pest. As part of a three-stage process, plants identified as potential pests are assessed. If there are no areas suitable for establishment, for instance, it's a tropical plant that can't grow in Canada, then no further regulatory action is taken. If it can grow in Canada and is widely spread, no regulatory action is taken. If the distribution is limited, but there are no control measures in place and no plans to put control measures in place, no regulatory action is taken. If it can grow in Canada, but the economic losses are not considered significant, no regulatory action is taken. The valuation of economic consequences is the most critical component in this process. Determining economic consequences is critical because it affects other criteria, like the determination of whether a plant is widespread. For instance, according to those IPPC guidelines, if a plant can spread into new areas and cause economic loss, the plant is not widely distributed. And they go on to say that economic loss has not been clearly understood. Countries like Canada have misinterpreted the term. Canada has largely evaluated potential economic impacts only in the agricultural and forestry sectors. They look at things like a crop yield loss, and the agency has not placed a monetary value on the environmental consequences, environmental impacts of invasive plants. We know that decisions based on a narrow set of market values of nature underpin the global biodiversity crisis. To better align the International Plant Protection Convention with the Convention on Biological Diversity, Canada must learn to account for environmental consequences in economic terms, and that is advised by the IPPC. So both policy and legislative change is required in Canada. Canada must recognize that nature has value and embed nature valuation into the decision-making processes. There are tools that already exist for this. I think ICAT was mentioned by a previous speaker. We should also take the advice from the IPPC and the Standards and Trade Development Facility and enhance our laws and policies to legally enshrine the protection of biodiversity. At the minimum, this could be done by updating the Plant Protection Act to explicitly protect the environment, as is the case with the US Plant Protection Act. But better still would be a Biosecurity Act or an explicit invasive species regulation like those that have been adopted in New Zealand, Australia, or the European Union. Under the new European Union legislation, for instance, there can be invasive alien species of union concern across all member countries. And I should note, those EU countries are also parties to the IPPC, the CBD, and the SPS agreement. So there are working models for change.
Cathy, you have 1 more minute.
Oh gosh, because the European Union and New Zealand and certain US states have better laws and regulations, they can prohibit the sales of ornamental trees like Tree of Heaven. Here in Canada, the CFIA recognizes that it poses significant threats to the environment, the economy, and public health. Because we lack the laws, all the CFIA can do is publish an alert: do not plant Tree of Heaven, consider removing it from your property, but still it remains for sale. To move forward, Canada needs to perform an environmental scan to review trends around the globe and adopt best practices. Many states south of our border are developing active programs to regulate ornamental plants. For instance, on the left is a portion of a poster from the Maine Department of Agriculture and Forestry, displaying some of the 63 plants on their do not sell list. This includes Tree of Heaven and Yellow Flag Iris. Canada needs to begin with those plants and start creating a national database for information sharing. We need to follow the schemes for pre- and post-border processes across the ornamental horticultural supply chain. All new plant species presented at the border should undergo risk analysis, paid for by importers, as is done in Australia and New Zealand. Post-border, we need to develop priority lists and begin assessments. Plants identified as high risk should be prohibited for sale. Other invasive plants should require labeling. Consumers should know when plants pose risk and be informed of their responsibilities. For instance, in Northern Ireland, Consumer Protection Acts require plants for sale are clearly and correctly labeled. The Horticultural Code of Good Practice recommends that customers be made aware of their legal responsibilities. For instance, for Carolina fanwort, an invasive aquatic plant in Canada, the label should clearly state, only use in aquariums, do not use outdoors, do not dispose of aquarium waste in ponds or watercourses. This just makes sense. It will present both challenges and opportunities for the horticultural sector, but removing the small number of highly invasive ornamental plants from sale can actually stimulate sales if handled correctly. In conclusion, I invite you to join the Canadian Coalition for Invasive Plant Regulation in our efforts to better protect our economy, environment, and public health from invasive plant species. To meet our obligations under the Convention on Biological Biodiversity, Canada must improve policies and legislation. We should create a science-based national plant risk assessment database. We should require all new imports undergo risk assessments. We should ban the sale and movement of high-risk invasive plants. We should require labeling to identify and educate the public about lower-risk invasive plants. We should provide continued and stable funding for public education and incentivize the adoption of the National Code of Conduct for ornamental horticultural industry. I thank you so much for this opportunity to speak. Sorry, I had to rush through things at the end. Please, you can find out more at our website, ccipr.ca. And I want to briefly thank our growing number of partners and supporters who are helping us in this endeavor. And I'll stop sharing so I can answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Cathy. I know that that was a deep topic to get into in such a short amount of time, but you've highlighted a lot of great gaps. And I think you've answered some questions as well as raised others.
Thank you so much.
I do have, I guess, more a comment and a question. What year did barberry have restrictions put on it, if you know?
Actually, the barberry restrictions started very, very early. In fact, early in the 19th century, and so there were basically trade embargoes. I think as early as 1930. I can pull up the references and send them to anyone who's interested. Again, please share my email. And I have all of the sort of the history of it. It's rather fascinating. And again, because it hosts this black stem rust, there was a lot of effort to keep it out of the country. The import ban was actually lifted in 2001 after about 10 years of lobbying by the horticultural trade, and they lifted the restriction for 11 cultivars that were resistant to the rust. And now I didn't get into this, but just this last year, the CFIA actually has issued an alert to the growers that says, gosh, what we didn't know is when these resistant cultivars have offspring, those offspring, unfortunately, are no longer resistant to rust. And they also flagged that these species like Terra, which is one of the cultivars, is highly invasive. And they have been prohibited for sale across many of the border states in the US because of the risks to biodiversity and public health.
Excellent, thank you. There are a couple comments there about knowing that barberry is still being sold, or they have seen it been sold.
Yes, there are resistant cultivars, and again, I didn't go into some of the complexity there, but it is one of the things that once you understand it will make you recognize that biodiversity is not being attended to, only the risk to agriculture and forestry.
Okay, thank you so much, Cathy. Cathy's email is in the chat if you wanted to grab that so that you can send her any questions. I believe the website to the CCIPR is also in the chat, but I mean, it's as simple as Googling that as well. Okay, thank you so much for joining us, Cathy.
Thank you
we do
very
need to
much.
move along.
Yes.
Okay. Firstly, before I pass it back to Mackenzie, I just wanted to thank you so much for listening to this session. If you are looking for some resources or information on invasive species, the ISC has a resource library that includes in-depth materials, including technical bulletins, best management practices, and videos. These resources are aimed at helping invasive species managers, as well as the public in the fight against invasive species. So visit our website to learn more about those resources. And lastly, don't forget to stick around for trivia. It's happening right after this. All you need to do is bring your invasive species knowledge and a mobile device, and there's a special prize for the winner as well. So, some friendly competition. And I'll pass it back to Mackenzie now.
Thanks so much, Teresa. Hoping to see everybody at trivia in a couple of minutes here. And just want to let everybody know to join us back at 12:30 for our keynote presentation with Bethany Bradley. If you joined for the whole morning, Bethany had quite a few shout outs to her work from some of her colleagues and students. So really looking forward to having her kick off the afternoon. I hope everybody enjoys lunch and invasive species trivia, and we'll see you back at 12:30 Eastern.